Okay, it looks like our participant numbers have started to level off, so we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Boyko. I'm the Senior Manager of Scientific Operations with the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, or CLSA for short. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar, which is entitled Impact of Physical Activity on the Relation Between Frailty and Hypertension in Males and Females in the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. That's a long title. Before we start, though, I would like to acknowledge that the CLSA National Coordinating Center and McMaster University are located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We also recognize that the University de Sherbrooke is located on the traditional territory of the Abenaki Nation of the Wabanaki Confederacy. As attendees of this webinar, I encourage you to continue your learning following the webinar and to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the lands where we all currently have the privilege to work and research and live wherever that may be for you. Now I'd like to review a few housekeeping points. First, everyone but the presenters will be muted throughout the webinar. If you need to change or test your audio during the webinar, you can just click on audio settings, which should be on the bottom of your Zoom window. And at the end of today's presentation, there will be a question and answer session. If you have a question for the presenter during the webinar, you can post it right away into the Q&A box, which is located in the bottom toolbar. The questions will all be addressed, though, at the very end of the webinar. And just also know that the questions will be visible to all the attendees. If you have any technical trouble concerning the webinar, you can use the chat box to communicate with our webinar team, and the chat box is usually on the side of your screen. So questions in the Q&A box and technical issues in the chat box. And finally, a feedback survey or questionnaire will be launched at the end of the webinar. And we invite you to complete it after exiting the webinar today, because this survey will provides us with important feedback that we can use to plan future CLSA webinars on topics that our data users will have value from. Now, today's webinar, again entitled Impact of Physical Activity on the Relation Between Frailty and Hypertension in Males and Females in the CLSA. It is the webinar is being presented by Miles O'Brien, who's at the University of Sherbrooke. Miles O'Brien is a research-based assistant professor within the Department of Medicine. He's been there since January 2024. His work studies the impact of mobility and posture on cardiovascular health and frailty in older adults. He also has an interest in building collaborations between researchers, hospitals, and community organizations to improve the day-to-day practices of their knowledge users. So with no further ado, I do pass it on to Miles. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. I'll share my screen. Does that look okay? Let's see. All right. Excellent. Well, thank you for everyone for coming today. And the great introduction. My name's Miles. I've been assistant prof here at the center at New Brunswick Medical Training Center for the last year now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done with the CLSA. I think one of the unique things that I want to highlight in this talk is clearly, you know, relationship between frailty and cardiovascular health. Talk about frailty a little bit, but really, I think the last half of this talk is going to direct more about some of the future things that I think will be interesting, building off some of our work as it relates to the CLSA, but then also how we've taken information and the results gleaned from CLSA to inform some of our boots on the ground style studies with interventions and community programs. So that's kind of the unique spin that I want to add on to some of the traditional CLSA webinars that I've been to in the past. So frailty as a concept is a nice way of describing how two people of the same age exhibit two different health levels. The most common ways of measuring frailty are the frailty phenotype, which is primarily a measure of physical frailty and looks at things like grip strength and walking speed, or the frailty index, which is going to be used in the work that I'm talking about here, and it measures frailty across a variety of conditions. It's considered multidimensional and looks at the overall health of the person. So several different aspects of health go into measuring frailty. It may be cognition, it may be self-rated health, it may be chronic condition based, and physical function is a key aspect of it. Ultimately, it looks at the overall health of the person, um, and starts to explain how people who have health problems or health deficits, as I may refer to them, are more likely to develop more health deficits. And so here we have the degree of frailty on the y-axis in the figure and age on the x-axis. And you can see as people get older, the number of health problems is not linear; it's curvilinear. As you get older, you develop more. You accumulate health problems at a greater rate, and so um, at least in my program, we've started to focus on not just the number of calendar years somebody has lived, but also what is their health status. In that you may have a 60-year-old and an 80-year-old who have very similar health levels, but are 20 years difference. As it fits with the talk today, we're going to look at the relation between frailty and the development of different cardiovascular conditions. The reason we focus on this is that frailty is this measure of somebody's overall health, the overall health of the organism. Targeting frailty and looking at frailty is particularly important because if you target the health of the organism, then many of the specific organs will benefit as well. We know that cardiovascular diseases are among the most common causes of death in Western society. So, if we can target the number of health deficits somebody accumulates, then their likelihood of developing a cardiovascular disease or some sort of related condition decreases. And I think that this Venn diagram does a nice way of showing the overlap between frailty and some of the expressions at the cellular level, et cetera, that overlap with conditions like cardiovascular disease. And so our group and the lab I did my postdoc in has spent a lot of work figuring out ways to best measure frailty in the CLSA and characterizing participants in the CLSA. And so on the left side, you can kind of see that members of the CLSA tend to have a frailty index between 0 and 0.15. I'll get into some of those specifics in a second, but essentially the number of health deficits present divided by the number of health deficits measured is how a frailty index is calculated. So this kind of indicates that around 10% or 0.1 of the number of health problems that are measured in our study, people have. And you can see on the right side that when we look at across age levels, age years, and you have frailty index on the y-axis, that females tend to have a higher frailty index at the same age than males, and we see that same curvilinear relationship there. And so ultimately, what are we trying to do with frailty and activity, and especially in some of the locally with us with in medicine, is we're trying to put people on a healthy aging trajectory. And so on the y-axis, we have frailty index on the left side and age in years on the x-axis. And what you may see in the light gray lines or light gray dots is a normal person's aging trajectory. As they get old, we accumulate health problems. And our goal as health researchers, especially in the realm of physical activity and exercise, is to put people on a lower trajectory. We want people developing health problems less rapidly and accumulating less of them overall. And so on the right side, we have some results from a meta-analysis that compared different aspects of intervention based on the available literature at the time. And the one that you can see at the top that is really the only one that error bars don't cross the standard mean difference of 0, is physical activity. And this kind of shows that physical activity is at least one of the best interventions that we can do to help address frailty, as it pertains to lifestyle and pharmacotherapy and psychological aspects. So the study I'm going to focus on today that forms the basis of this was work that I've done with my supervisor when I was a postdoc and now colleague at Dalhousie University Olgetheo, where we aim to look at what's the relationship between frailty with the presence of hypertension and heart disease. And then we explored whether or not physical activity was the mediator or explained this relationship between frailty and cardiovascular function between sexes. If you're interested in getting the details about this study, we've published it in the American Journal of Physiology, Heart and Circulatory Physiology, and I'll kind of run through some of the highlights of the study today. So frailty index in the CLSA, it really focuses on the number of health problems rather than the nature of them. There is no competitive scoring for a cognitive issue being more impactful than, say, a musculoskeletal issue. It focuses on counting the number of health problems. We initially used the frailty index that was developed previously that focused on 118 items, and then removed any items that were directly related to our outcome of interest. So anything cardiovascular in nature. So our final frailty index had 73 items that encompassed chronic conditions, cognitions, ADLs, anthropometrics, mental health, and hearing and vision. And as I mentioned, that we calculated it focusing on the number of deficits divided by the total number of deficits. And in this study, males had a frailty index score of 0.186, so about 18.6% of the health questions were present. They said yes to, and females were slightly higher at 0.192. Interestingly, females were slightly higher despite statistically having a slightly lower age on average, with their age being 62.7 versus 63.1. So we were able to, we expected that. We measured physical activity using the PACE, or the physical activity scale for the elderly. I'll get into some of the benefits and challenges of self-report measures later. But in general, these measured sitting time, muscle strengthening exercises, strenuous exercises, which we consider kind of a proxy of vigorous physical activity to correspond to the 24-hour movement guidelines in Canada. And then one of the challenges of the PACE is it considers walking separate from light and moderate. And we have done a lot of work in our lab to look at the energy expenditure of walking and how does different cadences affect whether or not walking should be light, moderate, or even vigorous. And we find that most of the time it's either light or moderate. So in this study, we lumped walking, light, and moderate into this single measure of light to moderate physical activity. The PACE asked participants about how they participated in activities over the week, and I provided kind of the example for sitting here, where it's never, seldom, sometimes, or often. And what we did was we took the middle point of each, and same thing with the amount of time, and multiplied them to get in an hours per week estimate. Hypertension, heart disease were measured by self-report, asking if a doctor has ever told them they have that specific condition. We did consider other cardiovascular measures such as peripheral vascular disease, angina, heart attack, stroke, and TIAs. But the incidence of these measurements were too low in the CLSA participants for us to conduct meaningful analysis. In general, they range from about 2 to 8% of people had the conditions. And then I highlight here some of the sex differences that we found in that females were more likely or had a higher incidence of PVD, but males had higher rates of angina, myocardial infarction, stroke, and then there was no sex differences for TIA. It's likely that with future follow-ups and as more people develop these conditions, our ability to provide insight into the specific other aspects of of cardiovascular disorders will be stronger. Okay, and so starting off first, we examine the relationship between frailty with hypertension. Frailty was treated as a continuous variable and hypertension was binary, yes, no. We performed logistic regressions and adjusted them for marital status, dwelling type, and chronological age or age in years. In general, males, 39% of males had diagnosed hypertension and 35% of females had diagnosed hypertension, with them being diagnosed for about 12 to 14 years on average. And as we can see on the figure on the right is for a 0.10 change or associated change in frailty, we see odds ratios of 1.08. So indicating that those with higher frailty, higher frailty was associated with a greater likelihood of having hypertension. And what we can see here is similar results for heart disease on the next slide. And these clearly are quite similar as well for males and females. The bars and confidence intervals look relatively similar to each other. For heart disease, though, males, it was present about 15% of males and 8% of females. Let me walk you through this figure. On this figure, we have what is the relationship with activity and hypertension by sex. And so we examined this for each of our 4 activity measurements: our sitting time, light to moderate physical activity, strenuous physical activity, and muscle strengthening activities. I present this just right now for hypertension, but frailty and heart disease show relatively similar findings with the certain nuances highlighted in text below. In general, what we see is that more strenuous physical activity and muscle strengthening activity and time spent doing those for both males and females was associated with a lower incidence of hypertension, whereas more sitting time was associated with a greater incidence of hypertension. And then the light to moderate physical activity tends to be a little bit more heterogeneous, where you can see for females on the bottom, the second white square is statistically significant, but for males above, the confidence intervals encompass 0, so it is not a significant predictor. What I want to highlight here is that when comparing the amount of time between the different types of activity, is that the beta values or the strength of the association tends to be about 7 times stronger for strenuous activity than sitting time for males, and 3.5 times higher for sitting versus strenuous. So taking this data and interpreting it and knowing what to do, this is one of the particular comparisons that I'm interested in, as engaging in one extra hour of strenuous activity a week, such as jogging or running or that sort of thing, may be more challenging than adjusting your sitting time by 7 hours per week. Maybe easier to sit less for an hour a day and give webinars like this than it would be to go for a run for 1 hour a week. So I find some of these comparisons particularly interesting, and then comparing males versus females, that it seems to be slightly lower for females, at least in comparing the sitting versus strenuous time. So when we use these to make recommendations, obviously we want to promote more activity, but also it seems that sitting less is useful. The effects are smaller, but in proportion to how easy it is to change, perhaps sitting could be a useful target. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with mediation models, I provided a little example here to try and simplify it. So our independent variable here is frailty, and we are looking at the relationship between frailty on the left side with hypertension, heart disease on the right side. We want to know if the relationship between frailty and hypertension is possibly explained by a third variable, in this case, physical activity or activity, as a mediator. So is frailty related to hypertension because people who are less frail engage in more activity, and the more activity is beneficial for our heart, or not? And so we conducted these mediation models. We used parallel mediation, which means we tested all of the physical activity variables at once in the same model and did not do it individually for each activity measurement. And then we adjusted these again for those covariates, marital status, dwelling type, and age. And so while this may look like a lot of numbers, let me walk you through it. First, I'm going to present to you the relationship between frailty and hypertension and activity variables as mediators. So here we can see that sitting time, strenuous activity, and strengthening activity we're all three related to both frailty and hypertension, meaning they met the requirement to be included in the model. But only strenuous activity, which I've identified by the italics, was a mediator of that relationship. So sitting time, strenuous, and strengthening were both related to our independent variable and our dependent variable, but strenuous was the only one that was a statistically significant mediator. And in all cases for this study, everything was a partial mediator, and the partial mediation ranged from about 5 to 10% of the relationship was explained by these activity variables. For females at follow-up, we can see that light to moderate physical activity met the requirements to be included in this analysis, and that sitting time, LMPA, and strenuous activity were statistically significant partial mediators of the relationship between frailty and hypertension. And while I'm going to have a summary slide at the end of some of these results, the way to think about this is that the relationship to frailty to hypertension can be partially explained by sitting time, light to moderate activity, and strenuous activity in females. Whereas strengthening activity was not a mediator in either sex. When looking at heart disease, we again found frailty was associated with heart disease, similar to our odds ratios analysis before. But strenuous activity was the only one that met the requirement of being associated with both frailty and heart disease, and that it was not a significant mediator. For females, however, sitting time, LMPA, and strenuous activity met the requirements, with light to moderate physical activity being the only significant partial mediator in this relationship. And so ultimately, our study showed that regardless of your sex, higher frailty levels was associated with a greater incidence of hypertension and heart disease. For frailty to hypertension, strenuous activity partially mediated this relationship in males, whereas for females, it was strenuous activity, sitting time, and light to moderate physical activity. And then when looking at heart disease specifically over hypertension, the only mediator was light to moderate physical activity, and it was for females only. It's useful to note, and I'll elaborate on this in a second, but the mediations were relatively small. The relationship between frailty and cardiovascular health wasn't fully explained by physical activity, but partially explained by it. And ultimately, this led to some of the conclusions and some of the news articles and whatnot that have been written about our article to indicate that sitting less and moving more could be useful for uncoupling the relationship between frailty and high blood pressure, especially high blood pressure, where more frequent mediators were observed across the sexes. And so with that being kind of our main study here, I want to now start to highlight some of the future directions that we're going in, or even future directions that I think others will find fruitful, linking frailty, activity, and cardiovascular function. So we found that a partial mediation was observed. So that means that there's still lots going on between the relation between frailty and cardiovascular health, or basically the number of health problems somebody has and their heart health, if you really want to simplify it. So some of the work that we're hoping to undertake includes my postdoc, Carson Hallowell, who's going to be looking at some of the relationships between other lifestyle behaviors, such as medication and diet, social interactions, and those sorts of things, really adapting the framework that was put out by the Canadian Frailty Network, and expanding it from just simply physical activity to looking at some of the other health aspects of it. And so we're hoping to get that started and also look at how does frailty relate to other aspects of chronic disease development, such as with osteoarthritis and other aspects of musculoskeletal health. Other colleagues from Dalhousie have just recently published an article creating a social vulnerability index. So frailty measures the number of health deficits, and they've used a very deficit-based model looking at social aspects of it. So how much of could social considerations be a factor in the CLSA? And now that there is a social vulnerability index developed for the CLSA, kind of sky's the limit on how that relates to things like chronic disease development or intersections with frailty as well. So I see that as a very useful direction moving forward. The other thing, we've taken a strong interest in looking at things like carotid intima media thickness, or you have carotid arteries kind of in your neck area, and the thickness of the layers of those arteries provide a proxy of stiffness and arteriosclerosis development. So we found that things like the thickness of those carotid intima media layers are highly related to frailty, particularly in females. So there's some interest in looking at how do these other cardiovascular factors beyond simply a doctor's diagnosis of hypertension or heart disease play a role in this. Especially coming from a cardiovascular background, it's very interesting to look at some of the specific cardiovascular outcomes that can be ascertained in the CLSA, and then applying it to kind of look under the hood of this relationship a little bit more. There's ECGs collected at each of the comprehensive assessments of the CLSA, as well as the carotid intima media thickness at baseline and follow-ups. And then I believe echoes are being added in some sites, at least in future instances of the CLSA. So we'll be able to get really specific measures of the heart and be able to tease apart how does frailty relate to cardiovascular function with these detailed measurements. So I see these as three fruitful directions in untangling some of the frailty to cardiovascular health relationships. The other thing is that the pace is challenging. The pace stops at greater than 4 hours as its most amount of activity, which I myself included, and all of us probably sit more than 4 hours a day, at least when we put objective monitors on people. I think I've yet to find too many people who sit less than 4 hours when it's objectively measured. So the absolute values from the PACE questionnaire to get at sitting time are off, but the relative values are probably okay. We can use it as a relative scale, but taking it as a maximum of 4 hours is a challenge, and we run into challenges with that. But again, I believe some of the sites are adding objective measures. So here we have the Tick Watch, which I believe is a GPS and will give things like steps. And then the one that I'm more excited for is the actigraph that people are putting on the thigh specifically, with the benefit of it being on the thigh is being able to distinguish upright behaviors from horizontal behaviors. And I'll elaborate a little bit more into some of the uses that we're going to use moving forward. And this is the specific one. So we found in our study that sitting time seemed to be this factor. And at least I want to say relative to how much easier it is to modify sitting time versus engaging in vigorous physical activity, which we can all agree is helpful and healthy, is that sitting time is a nice target because we do it a lot. And so if there's health effects to changing sitting time and standing up more, that's a useful thing for us to target in medicine and in developing models for people to engage in better lifestyle behaviors. So our group has been rigorously developing how to look at this sit to stand transition. You can see from these two figures, somebody without a stroke and somebody with a stroke, looking at the angular velocity of how fast it takes for somebody to get from a seated position to a standing position in real world time. So not going into the lab and testing them controlled, but putting a monitor on them and letting them do it in their free living conditions. We can look at how the accelerometer detects those changes in posture when it's worn on the thigh. And so a lot of this work's been developed, especially by my master's student, Liam Pellerine, who has been working with a group at Uppsala University in Sweden, and we've essentially developed a program that can easily distinguish how fast somebody goes from sitting to standing. And thinking of what happens when you go from sitting to standing is it's a big cardiovascular and musculoskeletal stimulus. I'm really excited to utilize the CLSA and apply some of the software that our teams developed to look at how does population aspects such as frailty and social vulnerability and all these things relate to a habitual functional measurement like getting up quickly. Other things that is mostly led by my master's student Sophie and PhD student Maddie is teasing apart different aspects of standing. So if sitting less is useful, what is the impact on things like standing, which the thigh-worn monitors will be able to discern for us in the future. A really neat direction that their work is going in is being able to distinguish passive standing versus active standing. And so by passive standing, it's standing very still. There's very little movement, whereas active or micro movement standing is you're standing, but you're moving a little bit. And the idea of this is that there's a lot of evidence there's a lot of confusing evidence that standing either is a positive health behavior, or there's some evidence to suggest it's not a beneficial behavior, and it's very similar to sitting. Our group is trying to uncover what's going on with this. And one of our theories is that standing, but doing lots of micro movements, and you probably can, when I say that, maybe you think of somebody who's standing, but they're always fidgeting or moving or something, may have a different health effect than passive standing, where you're standing really, really still. And so we've been developing programs and integrating some of these measurement tools to be able to look at how often do people stand, and then how often do they stand with lots of micro movements versus passive movements. And we've been applying things like machine learning and AI techniques to try and differentiate the two. We look forward to being able to access some of the CLSA data and tease apart these physical behaviors as well. So in addition to some of those developments, I've been integrated into the CLSA, or have started using the CLSA roughly around 2021. And now I use it a lot to help guide a lot of the hands-on community work and clinical trial work that we do in medicine. And so I've found it absolutely invaluable to keep directing that style of work and look at things from a populational level, and how can we influence local studies using that sort of information. So it's really been highly, highly complementary to some of the studies that I'm going to talk about. One of the particular ones that we've developed is Walk with a Future Doc. And so it's a walking program that we've developed that aims to offer a place for older adults to come learn about physical activity, healthy behaviors. They do a roughly 10-minute health education talk, and then they have a self-paced walk around the track while medical students run this program, and they walk with them and they talk with medical students, and they get to learn how their studies are going, and they informally ask questions about stuff, and ultimately it provides a place for them to get active. Most of the people who attend this tend to be older females. We get about 30 to 50 people show up every week. And we just finished our 6th cohort. So we're closing in on about 200, 250 people who have completed the whole program. And before and after, we do evaluations and build it into our university's medical student research curriculum. So students get to benefit because they, one, get the research experience that is required for their degree, but then they also get to work with members of the community and lead this healthy living initiative. And some of our preliminary work is showing that those who complete the program tend to decrease their frailty as long as they have a frailty index score of at least 0.1, which makes sense. If they are already non-frail, they stay non-frail. And those who show up with some degree of frailty leave less frail. So we use this as a tool that is somewhat informed from some of the big data to reach people in the community. Other things that we've been interested in is trying to take a look at the specifics of sitting time or sedentary time. We've developed a measurement system that puts 3 accelerometers on people's body. Here you can see on the right side that it's on their torso, their thigh, and their shin. And we wanted to look at how can we know more about sedentary time. The PACE broadly asks about sitting time, but using this model of multiple accelerometers, we can know if somebody is in a lying posture or if they are in a seated posture. And then when they're seated, are they seated with their legs bent or straight? So we're able to get really detailed sedentary posture characteristics. And then same thing, a lot of my students have done the work showing that it has about a 5-degree error. So if somebody's sitting at 90 degrees, the measurement devices pick up somewhere between 85 and 95, which we're very happy with because these can be worn 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, compared to motion capture. So we've done the validation work. And then when we've applied this work, what we find is there's a wide range of activity. So this is in young adults. Here we have a waterfall plot where it is individual participants. Each bar is an individual participant, and they don't perfectly line up. But what I want you to take away from this is just the heterogeneity of how people spend their sedentary time. Realistically, when we say sedentary time, oftentimes we think of bent leg sitting, which is that top left panel. And while I would say most of our activity is bent leg sitting, most sedentary activity, there's also a large chunk of straight leg sitting and a large chunk of sedentary time that is spent awake lying down, with it ranging even from 0 minutes a day, people who do not lie down while awake, to people who get upwards of 3 hours a day on average of awake time spent in a lying posture. And in young adults, we've been interested in what are the cardiovascular impacts of this, and we found that using heart rate variability as a measure of autonomic function, that it was mostly the lying time, awake time spent lying, that was most related to heart rate variability and less on sitting. So that was an interesting point for us and kind of encourages us to keep pursuing this and think that maybe not all sedentary postures are the same. And I think that's some of the information that at least we've been able to apply from big data and some of our other studies to help direct this style of work. It also leads us, as I kind of wrap up here, into some of our hospital work. So our group has shown that even when people can ambulate independently, they don't have any conditions that would precurse them from not being able to move. About 23-ish hours, 22 and a half hours of the day are spent in bed in hospital. And so one of our main studies here has been trying to address that, trying to make hospitals places of more activity. And it's certainly been an uphill battle, but one of the clinical trials that we're currently delivering right now aims to is to promote kinesiology in hospitals and promote exercise professionals in hospital. So we're looking at the effectiveness of a mobilization program in our hospital that aims to promote people moving more, but also moving more in whatever capacity is possible. So there's several people who may have trouble, say, engaging in strenuous activity or even light to moderate physical activity, but perhaps there's some benefit to even altering postures more often, such so laying less and even promoting sitting over laying, and then promoting standing over sitting, and so forth. So we've been applying our accelerometry to that. We've been measuring frailty, and we've been specifically targeting patients who do and do not have cardiovascular disease. So those results are still forthcoming, but I think it's important to highlight how CLSA and how some of these other works are guiding trials that we're doing locally as well. So ultimately, that is it for me. I have 40 minutes on the dot, which I think is exactly how long it was supposed to be. Attached is my email address. If you're interested in our work, if you're interested in learning more, please do not hesitate to reach out. And then there's some pictures of the people who actually do all the work. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a interesting presentation. Mobility and movement is always very interesting, and knowledge translation is very near to my heart in terms of making your research come to life and practical to users. I will open it up to participant questions now. I think we have people are being shy today. If you have any questions, just a note, put them into the chat section, the Q&A box, I said that wrong, and we'll get started with any questions. So
Okay, I got a question from Laura.
yeah.
I
So I'll read it out loud. We actually got this via email. I go to an aquasize class 3 times a week, and they hold a Zoomers class for balance in the area that I've attended. Which exercise might be more beneficial? I find the aquasize class gives me a fuller workout, and I feel like I have done something. What do you think of this comparison? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think, you know, the cop-out answer is basically any activity that you enjoy the most that you're willing to do is the best one, in terms of sustainability. So for example, you know, there's lots of quotes that's, I could design the best exercise program, but if nobody does it, it's ineffective. So I think ultimately I think the thing that you enjoy doing the most is the clear one. I think that in terms of physiological, I think it depends on stimulus, to be honest. So I think that things like balance and stuff are clearly more crucial, and that there's a lot of evidence that you don't need to feel spent after the workout for it to still be eliciting positive effects. I think that depending on what the Zoomers class consists of, even things like the aquasize class may be a greater aerobic stimulus than the Zoomers class, depending on what type of aerobic activity is doing. And at least our work would show that both aerobic and resistance are key factors. And so that really is if you had to pick one, it's tough to say which one is the best. I think it's more so which one do you see yourself frequently going to?
Next question is, where can I access FLS 118 or 73 items?
Yeah, so I would recommend the Blodgett et al. Age and Aging paper. I think the corresponding author to that is probably Olga Theo or Ken Rockwood, but if you Google them, you'll find the 118 item one. Also, I believe my slides are going to be shared after this, so and it has a little reference at the bottom. The 73 item, we purposely excluded items that were linked with cardiovascular diseases or were directly related. So for example, we removed things like stroke. So for you in your research, I think you take the 118 item and you look through it and see what is the outcome that you're interested in, and then remove the items from the frailty index that are so overlapped with that you are unclear if the relationship would be because of frailty truly, or if because your frailty index has a bunch of cardiovascular measurements in it, and they would clearly be related to cardiovascular function at the endpoint.
Great. And now we have a question from Dr. Lindsay Wallace from Dalhousie. She's curious about the med student run PA program, as was I. Sounds fascinating. Do you know if there's something similar at the Dalhousie Medical School, and are you involved in running?
Yeah, so the med program is affiliated. It's Dal New Brunswick are the RIM students that I have. We are constantly trying to build it here in Moncton as well, through the Sherbrooke Med program, and am trying to build it in a Halifax-based program. So I'm happy to chat more a lot about it. Fingers crossed, we're submitting a funding application the next like 2 weeks, and if that is funded, then we will expand it to everywhere possible. I know locally our biggest champion for it is the YMCA. We've paired up with the YMCA and they've offered us the track, and they love the program. Initially we've been running it for a while, and it is one of the challenges of running a program in multiple places, but the students and the medical students are very attracted to something like this. They love that they come once a week, they run a program, they do pre-post assessments before and after, they get to promote it. It's very near and dear to a lot of our hearts. So I am trying to expand it as much as I can. But if you have any ideas or are interested in being involved or anything like that, is don't be shy.
And just a little plug here, I was thinking, wouldn't it also be a great opportunity to incorporate into the intervention or the program participant engagement in the actual study design or
Yeah.
the work and sort of interpreting evidence. So
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Next question though, how would you compare and contrast the PACE versus the Golden Shepherd leisure time physical activity questioning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think um, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the Godin Shepherd's a little bit shorter. I know the pace can be expanded to include specific items. I don't know if that's specific to the um, the questionnaires included in the CLSA, but they're relatively similar in the sense that both use wording like strenuous for their vigorous. I say vigorous. What I interpret as vigorous, or use as a proxy of vigorous activity. Um, the pace is like as its name kind of indicates, it was developed with older adults in mind. And okay, somebody's going to answer this question live.
Nope,
But
that's
yeah,
just
that
me cleaning it up. Don't worry.
okay. Sorry, that's how I would differentiate the two. They are relatively similar. Yeah.
Yeah, when I click on and I have to click on answer live
Oh,
before
okay.
saying
Sorry.
stuff. So
Apologies.
just so we're on the same wavelength. Okay, well, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm wondering whether passive or minimal movement standing is similar or no different to sitting, or if there is still a benefit to passive standing.
Yeah, that's a great question, Julia. I think one is we don't know. There's a group that just kind of been putting forth analysis programs on teasing out passive versus active standing. And then what we've done is they've mostly focused on laboratory developments of this software and how machine learning can be used to differentiate the two. But we've been now taking it and trying to tease out how often do people even do active versus passive standing in a week, and what are some of the aspects that need to go into processing this. So our research program is really interested in testing whether or not passive standing is actually beneficial or not. And if it is, how much beneficial versus active versus sitting. So right now we don't know, but I'm hoping that things like um, the CLSA, maybe this is the right audiences to give it to, is going to be very easy to access things like the raw accelerometry data of their participants so that we can start to differentiate this on a population level. For us locally, we may collect, 100 or 200 people for a study, and that's considered relatively large, and look at active passive standing, but the CLSA may offer some better opportunities to look at this in a bigger scale. So we don't know yet. Right now, we know that sitting is not ideal and that the more that we're upright, the better. So until we tease those out, I can't give you a great answer, but we're trying to figure it out.
Yes, as the CLSA, we're finishing our third follow-up, and we'll have several thousand, I think, participants with the actigraph data. So I think once we were able to contribute to that database and have it also for our next follow-up, I definitely think there'll be huge value in it. So
Yeah.
okay, so from Jeanette, are there particular exercise considerations for wheelchair users that might be beneficial?
Yeah, and I think this is almost where things like I know there's been a lot of talk over the like sit less, move more challenges when it comes to people who are wheelchair users, and how some of the wording may not be fully appropriate for that population. I think that this is this is really interesting for those types of populations where things like cardiovascular health is even more paramount. So ultimately, it kind of goes back to the first answer, where it's anything that's being done that is enjoyable and sustainable and done for a certain degree of volume is good. More is better. But in terms of finding activities, I think it's about finding not just sports. Sports are a great outlet, and doing sports is great, but even just finding general activities that they may enjoy, those people would enjoy. And that it really comes down to, say, like, individual preference rather than the best exercise. I think there's a lot of work showing the cardiovascular benefits of things like rowing machines. And so, yeah, I think a lot of our work focuses on what is the best exercise, and I understand why people want to do that because they want to know their best bang for their buck. But the real answer is kind of just any of it. Any of it's good. It's just whatever you prefer.
We have another great idea, if it hasn't been thought of already. Have you thought of recruiting physio students for Walk with a Future Physio? I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, and I think it's not even just physios. Walk with, a future healthcare provider, or
Yeah.
we've teased lots of different ideas. We've used this one as med school because it's the proximity to the med school, and there is not a physio school in that area. But we want to expand it to physios. We want to expand it to any sort of health professional. We've also been teasing the idea of whether or not to expand it to other things like lift with a future doc or lift with a future healthcare provider, where it's focused on resistance training. So if anyone has community program ties and they're interested in doing that, feel free to steal my ideas. I think that the more people that we can get involved to help run community-based programs, the better.
Okay, so next, some more advice. Where would you advise seniors on getting advice on balancing risk of accident and need for stimulating exercise, particularly with increasing frailty, and given that family physicians mostly are not available for such advice?
Yeah, this is a good point. I think this is where people like physios and kinesiologists come into play. Really, these people are trained in delivering exercise prescriptions. We do a lot of work with exercise is medicine, and a lot of work tends to try helping train physicians to deliver exercise prescriptions, but ultimately knowing when to refer. So people like family physicians, I'm optimistic that they would have connections with exercise professionals to send people to or refer people to. But ultimately, there's several thousands of exercise professionals that graduate every year. And at least as my opinion as an exercise physiologist and coming from a kinesiology turned medicine background, I think that that's where a lot of the professionals are going to be able to deliver individualized, tailored programming that's going to be the most effective for those people. And oftentimes they have now models in place for being able to follow up a lot more frequently than, say, a family physician would, who has maybe less comfort prescribing exercise, less comfort talking about exercise, and then a little bit more challenges with regular follow-ups for those lifestyle behaviors.
Next question is, what would you suggest to a much older adult, so someone who might be over 80, who has worked very hard work at home, who has worked very hard work in the home and doing gardening and landscaping plus long-term care work, but now diagnosed with osteoarthritis?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think it's very similar, that it's any sort of walking, any sort of resistance training. I think that things like balance and resistance training are going to become even more important for some of people as they progress through 80. But for me, I know our target is getting up out of a chair and walking. Those are really two crucial things that are not problems until they are. So really lots of walking, lots of muscle strengthening exercises generally. And then I think it goes back to exercise professionals, if you're looking for really like tailored specifics, who can sit down with you and talk for half an hour to really get a profile of what that person's looking for and then how they can benefit.
And again, this last one is more of a comment, but I definitely think you'll have something to say about it or suggest. But as someone who works in a hospital and agrees very much with trying to increase mobilization programs in hospitals, it would be very interesting to also compare activity levels from activity or exercise in the bed lying down and sitting, as many patients are still too ill or unsafe for standing or walking.
Yeah, Anthony, I hope you're the one reviewing my grants for these projects. I think that's a great point, and that's what our clinical trials kind of promoting is we first we did our work in geriatrics initially and used just one monitor on the thigh, and we found, you know, the 22.5 hours of um of time, and then we started to get at, no, I think there's actually shifts in posture that would be beneficial for these people, and that it's the lying time that may actually be kind of the problem. And so we've begun doing that in the internal med unit here, and we're trying to expand to some of the other units as well.
And apparently he will fund it. I think not only approve or give you good reviews, but fund it. So there you go.
Yeah.
Okay, and Rhonda just wanted to note that older adults, that strength and balance are critical, and that walking does not meaningful affect strength or balance. But of course, it is helpful for cardiovascular health. So
I think to some degree it's relative. I think that walking in itself is very heterogeneous, and that's what our lab at least sees, is that walking can be slow walking and walking can be speed walking at peak. So I would argue that there's lots of evidence that it does in certain populations, particularly the frailer populations have those benefits, but agree to disagree kindly.
yeah, and I guess it is a matter of walking can be slow, fast, moderate. So I guess it's how you define it, right?
Yeah. And I think things like balance influence things like stride length and stride width and some of the step variability aspects that I know if you asked me to walk and text at the same time, I'm veering all over the place. And so
Don't do that. Okay, well, I think we have come to the end of the questions, which is perfect timing. So thank you again, Miles, for your presentation today. Lots of good questions and discussion. Took a few minutes to get our group warmed up, but I think definitely. Oh, Rhonda's still saying balance and strength affect walking more than the reverse. So thank you, Rhonda. I'd like to remind everyone that the next deadline for data access applications is April 9th, 2025. So it's coming up. You can please visit our data access section on our website to review what data is available, as well as details about the application process. As a friendly reminder to all of our CLSA data users to please keep us updated of any changes that may affect your data access agreements. For example, have you moved institutions? Has the research team changed? Has a trainee graduated or moved to a new position? These are very important changes that we need to make and keep on top of. You can always email the changes to our email at access@clsa-elcv.ca with any of these questions or updates. And I'd also like to remind everyone about completing their evaluation questionnaire upon exiting today. That would be very helpful. And what's next? Our next webinar will be presented on March 18th, and it will be presented by Nadine Akbar from the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. And registration details are on our website, and you can also find them in the chat box. And remember that the CLSA promotes the webinar series using the CLSA hashtag CLSA webinar, if you can tag us. And we also invite you to follow us on Twitter or X at CLSA_ELCV. So there's lots of ways to keep track of us and learn about upcoming webinars and data access deadlines. But for now, have an enjoyable rest of the day. Stay warm.